Hello there, and welcome back to Coldman Survival, where we spend our nights looking closely at the people who choose to live through the coldest months of the year in places most of us would consider far too small and far too exposed for comfort. Tonight, we are stepping inside a world that fits inside roughly 200 square feet, sometimes less, where a family or a single traveler or an aging couple who sold their house years ago will spend a subzero night surrounded by aluminum siding and a few inches of insulation, parked somewhere quiet, waiting for the temperature outside to drop below anything a tent or a car could survive. We are talking about the tiny camper, the travel trailer, the converted van, the truck camper bolted onto a pickup bed, all of them built originally with three-season use in mind, and all of them now being asked to do something their manufacturers never fully intended, which is to keep a human body warm and safe through a winter night when the air outside might reach 15, 20, even 30 degrees below freezing. There is something quietly remarkable about this choice, and I want to sit with that for a moment before we go any further. Most people, when they imagine surviving a brutal winter night, picture a cabin with thick log walls, or a house with a furnace running in the basement, or at the very least 4 solid walls built from lumber and insulation, and decades of construction knowledge aimed specifically at keeping cold weather outside. The RV lifer has none of that. They have a thin shell, usually aluminum or fiberglass over a wood or metal frame, with insulation measured in a single inch or two, large windows that were designed to let in summer light rather than block out winter wind, and a floor that sits only inches above open air, exposed underneath to whatever the wind is doing that night. And yet, somehow, night after night, in campgrounds and driveways and remote pullouts across some of the coldest regions of North America and Europe, these people close their doors, turn down their small heaters, climb into bed, and sleep. Before we go further into how they manage it, I would love to know if you are watching this from somewhere cold tonight yourself, somewhere the wind is already pressing against your own windows, or whether you are simply drawn to stories of people making warmth appear in places where warmth should not reasonably exist. Either way, I am glad you are here, and I hope this is the kind of video that helps you drift off slowly, one detail at a time, the way a good fire helps a room grow warm without anyone really noticing the exact moment it happened. If stories like this help you unwind, a like or a subscribe to Coldman Survival costs nothing and helps this channel keep finding the kind of viewer who actually wants to slow down at the end of a long day. Picture, for a moment, the scene we are about to spend the next while inside of. A gravel pullout somewhere in the high country, or a quiet corner of an off-season campground, or a stretch of public land where the nearest neighbor is a stand of frozen pines, rather than another human being. The light has already failed by 5 in the afternoon, the way it does at this latitude in the depths of winter, and what remains outside is a particular kind of stillness that only exists when the temperature has dropped far enough to slow even the wind, leaving behind a cold so complete it seems to have a weight to it, pressing gently against the thin walls of a camper that, from a distance, looks almost too small to matter against a landscape this large and this indifferent. And yet, inside that small shell, a lamp is on. A kettle is warming. Someone is pulling a curtain closed against a window that an hour from now will hold back a wind capable of stopping a person's breath if they stood in it too long without shelter. This is the scene we return to again and again on this channel, not because it is dramatic, but because it is the opposite of dramatic, a small, deliberate, almost stubborn act of comfort, carried out quietly against conditions that would seem to make comfort impossible. Now, let us step closer to the campers themselves. Because before we can understand how anyone survives a winter night in one of these small homes, we first need to understand who these people are, why they chose this life instead of a house with a basement furnace, and what exactly they are up against once the sun goes down and the temperature begins its long fall towards zero. The decision to spend winter inside a tiny camper rarely happens by accident, and almost never happens without the person involved fully understanding what they are choosing to give up. Full-time RV living has grown steadily over the past 2 decades, driven by a mixture of economic pressure, a desire for simplicity, remote work flexibility, and in some cases nothing more complicated than a genuine love of small spaces and open landscapes. Within that broader movement exists a smaller, more specific group of people who do not retreat south when autumn ends. They are sometimes called winter boondockers, sometimes called four-season travelers, and sometimes they simply describe themselves as people who never got around to leaving before the first snow arrived. Some are retired couples who converted a modest travel trailer into a permanent home after selling a house that had grown too large and too expensive to maintain. Some are younger remote workers who bought a used camper van specifically because a mortgage felt like an impossible weight, and a camper felt like freedom instead. Some are seasonal workers, ski resort employees, or wildlife researchers or contractors following jobs from one cold region to the next, for whom a camper simply happens to be where they are living when winter closes in around them. And some, quite honestly, are people who tried living this way in summer, fell in love with the simplicity of it, and then made the deliberate choice to see whether they could make it work in January as well as July. What almost all of them share is a clear-eyed understanding that a recreational vehicle was not built for this. Manufacturers design most travel trailers and truck campers around a specific set of assumptions, namely that the unit will be used in spring, summer, and early autumn, then drained, winterized, and stored somewhere dry until the weather warms again. The insulation in the walls is often minimal by house standards, sometimes just an inch of foam board or fiberglass batting sandwiched between thin exterior and interior panels. The water lines run exposed along the underside of the floor in many models, vulnerable to freezing the moment the temperature drops low enough for long enough. The windows, particularly older single-pane versions common in many trailers, lose heat rapidly and collect condensation the way a cold glass of water sweats in a warm room. None of this stops the people who choose winter RV life, but it does mean that every single one of them has had to become, in effect, an amateur building scientist, learning through trial and error and long nights of research exactly how heat escapes a small structure and exactly what can be done to slow that escape down. There is a particular kind of confidence that develops in someone who has weathered several genuinely brutal nights inside a camper that was never designed for the job. It is not recklessness. If anything, it is closer to the opposite, a deep and specific caution built from experience, the kind of caution that checks a propane gauge twice before bed and knows exactly which corner of the trailer will feel coldest by morning. Ask any experienced winter camper why they do this instead of simply renting an apartment for a few cold months, and the answers vary, but a certain thread runs through most of them. There is a sense of earned comfort in this life that is different from the comfort of a house, precisely because it had to be built rather than simply inherited from 4 solid walls. A house is warm because it was designed to be warm. A winter camper is warm because someone made it warm, piece by piece, decision by decision, and that difference matters enormously to the people living it. Before we look at exactly how they do that, it is worth sitting for a moment with the physical reality of what a sub-zero night actually does to a structure this small. Heat does not simply sit inside a tiny camper waiting to be used. It moves constantly, seeking the coldest available surface, slipping through window seals, sliding along uninsulated corners where the roof meets the walls, escaping downward through the floor into whatever cold air is trapped beneath the chassis. In a house, this loss happens too, but the sheer volume of interior space and the thickness of the walls slow it down considerably. In a camper, the ratio of exterior surface area to interior volume is far less forgiving. Every square foot of thin wall is working overtime, exposed to the outside air on one side, and asked to hold warmth in on the other, with very little material in between to make that job easier. This is the central engineering problem that every winter RV lifer has to solve in their own way, using a combination of physical modifications to the camper itself, careful heat and power management, and behavioral adjustments to how they live inside such a compressed space. It is worth pausing here to consider just how counterintuitive this all is compared to the way most of us think about winter safety. We are taught, almost from childhood, that surviving extreme cold means finding thick walls, going underground if necessary, seeking out the most solid shelter available. The RV lifer inverts that instinct entirely, choosing instead a structure whose walls, if you removed the thin exterior paneling, would reveal an inch or two of insulation, not much more substantial than a winter coat, stretched over a wooden or aluminum frame that offers almost no thermal mass of its own. If you have ever knocked on the wall of a travel trailer, you already know the sound it makes. A light, hollow knock utterly unlike the dull thud of a plaster wall in a house. That hollow sound is, in many ways, the entire challenge of winter RV, living compressed into a single moment. A reminder that everything standing between a warm interior and a lethal exterior temperature is remarkably thin, remarkably light, and remarkably dependent on human attention rather than raw material mass to do its job. And it is precisely because the margin is so thin that the people who do this successfully tend to develop such careful, almost ritualistic habits around every aspect of their nightly routine. Because in a house, a lapse in attention rarely has serious consequences. The walls themselves absorb the mistake. In a camper this size, during a night this cold, there is no such buffer, and every winter RV lifer knows it, whether or not they would ever phrase it in quite those terms. And it is to that first challenge, the physical modifications, sealing and insulating an already thin structure against a wind that has no patience for gaps, that we turn next. Long before the first snowflake falls, the preparation for a winter night inside a tiny camper has already begun, often weeks in advance, and it centers almost entirely on a single, unglamorous goal, which is closing every possible gap through which cold air can enter and warm air can escape. The most visible and arguably most important of these modifications is skirting, a term that describes wrapping material around the base of the camper, from the bottom edge of the walls down to the ground, sealing off the open space beneath the trailer, where wind would otherwise blow freely underneath the floor. Without skirting, the underside of a camper acts almost like an open-air tunnel, funneling cold wind directly beneath the living space and turning an already thin floor into one of the coldest surfaces in the entire structure. Experienced winter campers use everything from purpose-built vinyl skirting kits, sold specifically for this purpose, to simple sheets of rigid foam board cut and fitted by hand, to hay bales stacked around the perimeter in more rural or remote settings where a hardware store run simply is not practical. Whatever the material, the goal remains identical: to create a still pocket of air beneath the trailer that is no longer directly exposed to moving wind, which alone can raise the interior floor temperature by a noticeable and meaningful margin on a cold night. Above the skirting line, attention turns to the windows, which in most travel trailers represent the single greatest source of heat loss relative to their size. A single pane of glass offers almost no resistance to cold, and even double-pane windows found in higher-end units lose heat far faster than an insulated wall ever would. The most common solution, used by nearly every serious winter camper, involves cutting sheets of reflective foam insulation, often sold under a well-known brand name recognizable to anyone who has spent time in the RV community, into precise shapes that fit snugly inside each window frame. These panels reflect radiant heat back into the living space while adding a meaningful layer of insulating air, and they are typically installed at dusk and removed again in the morning to allow daylight back in, becoming as much a part of the evening routine as brushing teeth or checking the weather forecast. Some campers go further, layering heavy thermal curtains over the foam inserts, particularly around the large windshield-style windows common in van conversions and cab-over-truck campers, where the glass area is largest and the potential heat loss is greatest. Roof vents present a similar challenge on a smaller scale, and most winter-ready campers use insulated vent cushions or foam blocks, cut to fit snugly into each ceiling vent opening, closing off yet another pathway through which warm interior air would otherwise rise and escape into the freezing night above. Doors receive their own attention as well, with foam weather stripping applied around every seam and gap, sometimes supplemented by a simple draft snake, a fabric tube filled with rice or sand, laid along the bottom threshold where the door meets the floor. None of these individual measures accomplishes very much on its own. A single foam window insert or a single strip of weather stripping might reduce heat loss by only a small percentage. But winter RV lifers understand something that a casual observer often misses, which is that survival in a structure this thin depends entirely on the cumulative effect of dozens of small ceiling measures working together, each one closing a slightly different gap, each one slowing the escape of heat by a slightly different margin until the sum total of all these small efforts adds up to a living space that can genuinely be warmed and held warm through a long, cold night. There is also a second, quieter battle happening alongside the ceiling effort, and this one concerns moisture rather than temperature. Every breath a person exhales, every pot of water boiled for tea, every load of laundry hung to dry inside a closed camper releases water vapor into the air, and in a space this small and this well-sealed, that vapor has nowhere to go. It rises, meets the cold surface of a window or an uninsulated ceiling panel, and condenses into droplets that can, over the course of a long winter, lead to mold, rot, and damage to the wood structure beneath the camper's thin walls. Experienced winter campers manage this constant, mostly invisible threat through a combination of small vent fans left running on low overnight, moisture-absorbing products placed in corners and closets, and a disciplined habit of cracking a single roof vent slightly open even on the coldest nights, accepting a small, deliberate heat loss in exchange for keeping the interior air dry enough to avoid the much larger problem of trapped moisture freezing and thawing against the camper's inner walls night after night. It is a delicate balance, sealing tightly enough to hold warmth, while still allowing enough airflow to keep the space from slowly rotting from the inside out. And it is one that every winter RV lifer eventually learns to read almost intuitively, checking the inside of a cold window each morning the way someone else might check the sky. understanding immediately from the amount of condensation gathered overnight whether their moisture management the night before had struck the right balance or needed adjusting before the next freeze arrived. Beyond the windows and the skirting and the vents, a quieter category of preparation happens underneath the camper itself, in places most visitors to a winter campsite would never think to look. Water lines run along the belly of most trailers in a tangle of tubing that was never meant to see a hard freeze, and before that tubing can be trusted through a subzero night, it typically gets wrapped by hand, foot by foot, in heat tape and then in a layer of foam pipe insulation over top of that, a task that often takes an entire cold afternoon crouched beneath the trailer with a flashlight and a roll of tape, checking each joint and elbow fitting for the gaps where cold air likes to find its way in. Slide-out sections, common in larger trailers and fifth wheels, present their own particular vulnerability, since the mechanism that allows a room to expand outward in warmer weather also creates a seam along the floor and ceiling that is notoriously difficult to seal completely, and many winter campers simply choose to keep their slides retracted for the entire cold season, sacrificing the extra square footage they enjoyed all summer in exchange for a tighter, more defensible perimeter against the cold. Even the small things receive attention that a summer camper would never think to give them. A towel rolled and tucked beneath the entry door each night, a strip of foam pressed into the gap around the air conditioner unit sitting unused on the roof, a scrap of insulation wedged behind the refrigerator vent where warm air is known to slip out toward the cold night beyond. None of it looks impressive from the outside. A camper prepared for a subzero night in this way still looks, to a passing stranger, like nothing more than a small trailer sitting quietly in the snow. But underneath that unremarkable exterior sits an accumulation of dozens of small decisions, each one addressing a specific weakness that this particular camper revealed over a previous cold night, each one representing a lesson learned the hard way, through a chilly morning, or a damp corner, or a pipe that froze once and never again. Sealing a camper against the cold solves only half of the problem, because a well-insulated box with no heat inside it will still eventually match the temperature of the air surrounding it, only more slowly than an unsealed one would. The second half of winter survival in a tiny camper concerns generating and managing heat itself, and this is where the choices become both more consequential and more personal, shaped heavily by budget, by camper size, by whether a person has access to shore power at a campground, or is relying entirely on their own stored energy in a more remote setting. The most common primary heat source remains the propane furnace, built into most travel trailers and fifth wheels from the factory, a forced air system that draws propane from an external tank, ignites it in a sealed combustion chamber, and blows the resulting heat through ductwork into the living space. These furnaces are effective and critically safe in the sense that they vent combustion byproducts directly outside the camper rather than releasing them into the living space, but they carry two significant drawbacks that every winter camper eventually learns to respect. First, they consume propane at a rate that can empty even a large tank within a matter of days during a genuinely cold stretch, meaning a serious winter camper often finds themselves refilling propane tanks on a schedule that would have seemed almost unimaginable during a summer of casual weekend trips. Second, the blower fan that circulates the heated air draws a meaningful amount of electrical current, which matters enormously to anyone not connected to shore power and relying instead on a battery bank charged by solar panels or a generator, since a furnace running through a long, dark winter night with little sun to recharge the batteries can drain a power system faster than it can be replenished. Because of these two limitations, propane cost and battery drain, many winter RV lifers supplement or entirely bypass their built-in furnace in favor of alternative heat sources, each with its own set of trade-offs. Electric space heaters, when the camper is connected to reliable shore power at a campground with winter hookups, offer a simple and often more economical solution, converting electricity directly into heat without touching the propane supply at all, though they become entirely useless the moment shore power is unavailable. Catalytic propane heaters, a different technology from the forced air furnace, produce heat through a flameless chemical reaction rather than an open flame, drawing very little electrical power and making them popular among boondockers who need heat without draining their batteries. Though these units release their combustion byproducts directly into the living space rather than venting outside, which means they require careful attention to ventilation and cannot simply be left running unmonitored through an entire night. Wood stoves, once considered impractical in a vehicle this small, have seen a genuine resurgence among winter van conversion owners in particular, with compact steel stoves designed specifically for tiny spaces now installed in many custom-built rigs, offering a heat source that requires no electricity and no propane at all, only a steady supply of small, seasoned firewood carried along or gathered locally, though installing one safely requires careful planning around clearances, flue placement, and fire risk in a space where nothing sits more than a few feet away from anything else. Alongside whatever primary heat source is chosen, nearly every winter RV lifer also invests heavily in what might be called passive heat retention, meaning insulated window coverings pulled tight each evening, heavy curtains separating the sleeping area from the rest of the camper to concentrate warmth in a smaller volume of air overnight, and thick rugs laid over cold laminate or vinyl flooring to slow the loss of heat downward into the chassis below. Water management adds yet another layer of complexity specific to genuinely subzero conditions, since the same exposed water lines that make a camper vulnerable to cold in the first place will freeze solid within hours if left unprotected, cracking pipes and leaving a camper without running water at exactly the moment it matters most. Serious winter campers wrap their exposed water lines and holding tanks in electric heat tape, a thin cable that generates a small, steady amount of warmth along its length. And many drain their freshwater tanks entirely during the coldest stretches, relying instead on jugs of water carried inside the heated living space, where freezing simply is not a risk. All of this, the propane calculations, the battery monitoring, the heat tape checks, the nightly ritual of drawing curtains and sealing windows, becomes woven into a routine so familiar that most experienced winter campers can perform it almost without thinking. The way anyone develops a habit through sheer repetition, checking the weather forecast one final time, glancing at the propane gauge, confirming the battery percentage on a small monitor mounted near the door, and only then, once every variable has been accounted for, settling in for the night ahead. What makes this nightly calculation so demanding is that none of the individual numbers involved are especially forgiving of a mistake. A propane tank that reads a quarter full at dusk might comfortably last through a mild night and still be sitting at nearly the same level by morning, or it might drain far faster than expected if the wind picks up and the furnace cycles on more frequently to compensate for the additional heat loss along the walls. A battery bank showing 60% charge might recover fully the next day under a clear winter sky with strong solar input, or it might sit at the same discouraging percentage for 3 or 4 consecutive overcast days in a row, forcing difficult choices about which systems can run and which must be switched off entirely to preserve enough reserve for the furnace blower and the small string of interior lights that make the evening feel like something other than simple endurance. Many experienced winter campers keep a small paper notebook or a simple phone app specifically to track these numbers night after night, not because the technology demands it, but because pattern recognition built from dozens of previous cold nights becomes, over time, more valuable than any single manufacturer specification. They learn, through repetition rather than instruction, exactly how many hours a full tank lasts at a given outdoor temperature, exactly how much solar recovery to expect on a partly cloudy January afternoon, exactly which corner of their particular camper loses heat fastest and therefore deserves an extra blanket draped across it before bed. This accumulated, highly specific knowledge, unique to each individual rig and each individual owner's tolerance for risk, is arguably the single most valuable resource any winter RV lifer carries with them, more valuable in practice than any single piece of equipment, because it allows a person to read the coming night accurately before it has even fully arrived, adjusting their preparations not from a manual but from memory, and settling into bed with a quiet confidence built from every previous night that came before this one, and was survived, comfortably, in exactly this way. Living through a sub-zero winter inside a space this small requires more than warmth and sealed windows, because a family or a couple confined to 200 square feet or less for weeks at a time, with the outside world genuinely dangerous to spend much time in, must also solve the quieter problem of how to actually live inside such a compressed footprint without the walls beginning to feel like they are closing in. This challenge intensifies considerably in winter compared to the same camper's summer life, because summer offers an escape valve that winter closes off entirely, namely the outdoors itself. A camper in July functions as little more than a bedroom and kitchen, with the awning, the picnic table, the surrounding campsite all serving as additional rooms that exist just outside the door. A camper in January offers no such extension. The awning is buried in snow or simply not deployed at all given the wind. The picnic table sits under a foot of accumulation. Every square foot of living space a person has access to exists entirely within those same aluminum walls, and this reality forces a particular kind of resourcefulness that experienced winter RV lifers describe almost universally once you ask them directly about it. Furniture in a winter-ready camper tends to serve at least two purposes, often three, because a single-purpose object is a luxury that a 200-square-foot home in sub-zero conditions genuinely cannot afford. A dinette table folds down into an additional sleeping surface. Storage benches double as seating, and underneath their cushions hold the folded winter clothing and extra bedding that will not fit anywhere else. A single countertop area, sometimes barely large enough for one cutting board, handles meal preparation, morning coffee, evening reading, and occasional work tasks for those who happen to be earning a living remotely from inside their rolling home. This constant multi-purposing of every surface and every object extends to clothing and bedding as well, with many winter campers adopting a deliberately minimal wardrobe built around layering rather than volume. A handful of high-quality thermal base layers, a couple of insulated mid-layers, and one serious outer shell for the brief trips outside to check on the skirting or refill a water jug, all chosen specifically because they take up a fraction of the closet space that a more conventional winter wardrobe would demand. Sleep itself becomes a carefully engineered small ritual rather than a simple matter of climbing into bed. Many winter campers use a layered bedding system, similar in principle to what a serious backcountry hiker might use, a base sleeping pad or foam layer between the mattress and the cold outside air pressing up from below, a warm blanket or comforter rated for genuinely low temperatures, and often a curtain or temporary partition drawn closed around the sleeping area, specifically to trap the smallest possible volume of air and allow the heater, whatever form it takes, to warm that small space far more efficiently than it could warm the entire camper at once. The evening routine, in the homes of people who have done this for multiple winters, follows a rhythm as consistent and almost meditative as any long-practiced habit, and it typically begins well before actual darkness falls, because cold settles into a thin-walled structure far faster once the sun drops below the horizon and there is no longer even the faint warming effect of daylight against the exterior walls. Window insulation panels go in first, fitted into place one at a time, each one clicking snugly into its frame with the particular satisfaction of a task performed many times before. Curtains follow, drawn across each covered window as an additional barrier. The heat source, whichever one a particular camper relies on, gets checked, adjusted, and settled into its overnight setting, with propane levels or battery percentages confirmed one final time. Dishes from the evening meal get washed and put away immediately, partly from simple tidiness in a space with almost no room for clutter, and partly because a countertop covered in dishes overnight. In a space this small becomes a genuine obstacle, rather than a minor inconvenience by morning. And then, once every task has been completed, once the small space has been sealed and warmed and organized as tightly as it can be, the people living through this particular kind of winter finally allow themselves to slow down, to read, to talk quietly, to simply exist for an hour or two inside a small, warm pocket of light and heat, surrounded on every side by a genuinely brutal winter night. There is something else worth mentioning about this compressed version of life, something that many winter RV lifers describe only when asked directly, because it rarely occurs to them as noteworthy until someone points it out. Living this way for an entire winter tends to sharpen a person's relationship with the few objects they do keep close at hand. A single favorite mug, used every single night for tea in the hour before sleep, takes on a weight and familiarity that a whole cabinet of mismatched mugs in a large kitchen never quite achieves. A particular blanket, chosen specifically for its warmth and kept folded at the foot of the bed, becomes something closer to a trusted piece of equipment than simple bedding. Even the small rituals of tidying up before bed, wiping down the counter, folding the day's clothing into its designated cubby, checking that nothing has been left where it might create clutter by morning, take on a calming, almost meditative quality precisely because the space is so small that every object has to have a place, and every evening ends with all of those places restored to order before sleep is even considered. Couples and families who winter together in these small spaces often describe a particular kind of closeness that develops under these conditions. Not always easy, certainly not always comfortable in the way a spacious house would be, but genuine in a way that space alone cannot manufacture. Conversations happen because there is simply nowhere else to be but within earshot of one another. Small kindnesses, an extra blanket passed across the bed, a warm drink made without being asked, matter more visibly in a space this size than they might in a house where such gestures could easily go unnoticed in a separate room. None of this makes the cold outside any less real, or the preparation any less demanding, but it does help explain why so many people, once they have survived a first winter in a tiny camper, choose to do it again the following year, rather than retreating to a more conventional home the moment spring arrives. And it is in that quiet hour, once the preparation is finished and the wind outside has begun in earnest against the thin aluminum walls, that we will pick up our story next. Once the last curtain has been drawn, and the last check of the propane gauge and the battery monitor has been completed, the night itself begins in earnest, and it arrives, for most winter RV lifers, as a series of sounds rather than a single dramatic event. The first sound is usually the wind, which at this hour has typically shifted from the steady daytime breeze into something more insistent, pressing against the broad, flat side of the trailer with a low, continuous pressure that makes the thin aluminum walls flex almost imperceptibly, a movement too small to see but distinctly audible as a faint, rhythmic creak that experienced campers learn to recognize as ordinary rather than alarming within their first few cold nights. The second sound is the heater itself, whichever form it takes, cycling on with a soft mechanical hum, running for a stretch of minutes, and cycling off again once the small thermostat mounted on the wall decides the interior has reached its target temperature, only to click back on again a short while later as the relentless cold outside continues drawing heat out through every seam and seal, no matter how carefully it was prepared earlier in the evening. Beneath both of these sights a third, quieter sound, the occasional soft tick and settle of the camper's frame itself, aluminum and wood contracting slightly as the temperature difference between the heated interior and the frozen exterior air continues to widen through the deepest hours of the night, a sound so faint and so specific to this particular kind of shelter that it becomes, for many long-time winter campers, oddly reassuring rather than unsettling, a small auditory confirmation that the walls around them are doing exactly the quiet, unglamorous work they were prepared to do. Snow, when it falls during one of these nights, adds its own distinct quality to the soundscape, a soft accumulating hush that gradually mutes even the wind itself as a growing layer builds across the roof and settles against the skirting below, until by the deepest hour of the night the loudest sound inside the camper is often nothing more than a person's own breathing and the occasional gentle tick of the heater completing another cycle. Sleep, under these conditions, tends to come in a different rhythm than it does in a house. Many winter campers describe waking briefly 2 or 3 times through a genuinely cold night, not from discomfort exactly, but from a kind of habitual, half-conscious check, a hand reaching instinctively to confirm that a blanket has not slipped, an ear listening for a moment to confirm the heater is still cycling normally, eyes opening just long enough to register the faint glow of a small battery monitor mounted near the door before drifting back into sleep, reassured that everything remains exactly as it should be. This is not anxious wakefulness, so much as it is a kind of practiced vigilance, the same instinct that allows a new parent to sleep soundly while still registering a change in a child's breathing from across a dark room, honed over enough winters that it happens almost without conscious thought at all. And then, gradually, imperceptibly, the deepest and coldest part of the night passes, the hour just before dawn when the outside temperature typically reaches its lowest point of the entire cycle, and the small camper, having weathered that coldest stretch successfully, begins its slow return toward morning. Light arrives first as the faintest gray change at the very edges of the window insulation panels, a signal for those attuned to it that it is nearly time to begin the reverse of the previous evening's ritual, pulling curtains open, unclipping foam panels from window frames one at a time, and looking out, often for the first time in many hours, at whatever the night has left behind, and what it has usually left behind, on a night cold enough and snowy enough to warrant this kind of preparation in the first place, is a landscape transformed almost beyond recognition from the one that existed the previous afternoon. Snow drifted against the base of the skirting, sometimes deep enough to require a few minutes of clearing before the day's first outdoor task can even begin. A layer of fine, dry snow settled evenly across the roof, undisturbed except perhaps by the faint outline of where a roof vent, slightly warmer than the surrounding surface thanks to the heat escaping from below, has melted a small, clear patch through the accumulation. The world outside, whether it consists of dense forest open high desert, or the quiet rows of an off-season campground, has been reshaped overnight into something hushed and unfamiliar. Every hard edge softened, every sound muffled, the entire scene holding the particular kind of stillness that only exists in the hour just after a heavy snowfall has ended and before anyone has yet disturbed it. For the person stepping carefully out of a small, warm camper into that scene, coffee already warming on the stove behind them, there is a specific and quiet satisfaction that comes from having spent the night successfully on the difficult side of that transformation, from having watched, in effect, the very conditions that reshaped the entire landscape overnight pass directly against their own thin walls and fail, ultimately, to reach them. It is this moment, more than almost any other in the winter RV lifer's daily rhythm, that many of them describe as the actual reward for all of the preparation we have spent this video exploring. Not comfort for its own sake, but comfort earned specifically against a backdrop this demanding, made all the more meaningful by how completely the world outside has changed while the small world inside remained steady, warm, and quiet through all of it. And it is from this exact morning, standing in fresh snow beside a camper that kept its promise through another brutal night, that our story will continue. The first hour after a cold night like this one follows its own particular sequence, repeated with only minor variation across nearly every winter camper we might visit, regardless of whether they are parked in a formal campground with water and electric hookups or tucked into a remote pullout accessible only by four-wheel drive. Coffee comes first, almost universally, brewed on a small stovetop percolator, or a simple drip cone rather than anything requiring significant electrical draw. The smell of it filling the small interior within minutes and providing, alongside the warmth of the mug itself, a kind of psychological signal that the night has ended successfully and the day's more active tasks can now begin. While that coffee brews, the system's check happens almost automatically. A glance at the battery monitor to see how much charge remains after a long night of heater cycles. A look at the propane gauge to estimate how many more nights the current tank will support. A mental note of the outside temperature read from a small thermometer mounted just outside the window. Information that will shape every decision made for the rest of the day, from whether to run the generator for an hour, to top off the batteries, to whether it is finally time to drive into town for a propane refill before the next cold front arrives. Only after this quiet internal accounting is complete does a person typically step outside, and the first task waiting for them there is almost always snow-related in some fashion, whether that means clearing a path from the door to wherever the truck or tow vehicle sits, brushing accumulated snow off solar panels mounted on the roof so they can begin generating power again as the sun climbs, or simply checking the skirting around the base of the trailer to confirm that overnight drifting has not buried a vent or blocked airflow to an area that needs it. None of these tasks take especially long individually, but together they form a morning ritual that experienced winter campers describe as oddly satisfying rather than burdensome. A physical, outdoor counterpart to the indoor sealing ritual performed the evening before, both of them small acts of attention paid to a home that, unlike a house, cannot simply be left to manage itself through an entire season. Breakfast, when it happens, tends to be simple by necessity. Oatmeal or eggs cooked on a 2-burner propane stove, eaten at the same small table that served as a workspace the evening before, and will likely fold away again before midday, to free up floor space for whatever the day requires. And it is often over this modest breakfast, mug in hand, looking out through a window that only hours earlier was covered by a sheet of reflective foam insulation, that the particular rhythm of winter RV life becomes most visible, a life built almost entirely around small, repeated acts of maintenance and attention, each one unremarkable on its own, each one essential in combination, each one part of a larger pattern that adds up, night after night and morning after morning, to genuine survival and even genuine comfort in conditions that would seem to anyone standing outside that small warm shell, entirely unsurvivable. Once that first coffee has been finished and the immediate outdoor tasks completed, the remainder of a winter morning inside a tiny camper tends to fill with a particular kind of forward planning that has no real equivalent in a conventional house, precisely because a house rarely forces its occupants to think several days ahead about resources in quite the same way. A homeowner glancing at a thermostat rarely wonders whether the furnace will still have fuel 3 days from now. A winter camper, by contrast, spends a meaningful portion of most mornings doing exactly this kind of quiet arithmetic, translating the previous night's propane consumption and battery drain into a rough estimate of how many more comparably cold nights the current supplies can support, and weighing that estimate against the extended forecast pulled up on a phone or a small weather radio kept specifically for this purpose. If the numbers suggest a propane refill will be needed within the next day or two, that errand typically gets folded into whatever other tasks the day already requires. A drive into the nearest town not simply for groceries, but specifically timed around which hardware store or gas station carries propane exchange tanks, sometimes requiring a genuine detour of considerable distance for campers parked in more remote locations. If the extended forecast shows a particularly severe cold snap approaching in the coming days, this morning planning session often expands to include additional preparation, topping off water jugs while temperatures remain manageable enough to do so comfortably, checking that extra propane or a backup heater is genuinely available rather than simply assumed, and in some cases making the deliberate choice to relocate entirely, moving the camper to a location with better wind protection, closer proximity to services, or simply a lower elevation where temperatures tend to run a few critical degrees warmer than the more exposed spot used the night before. This constant, low-grade forecasting and resource management, performed almost every single morning throughout the winter season, becomes over time less a chore and more simply the texture of daily life, the way checking email or scrolling a newsfeed might structure someone else's morning in a more conventional home. And it is precisely this rhythm, repeated with only minor variation across an entire winter, night after night of preparation, followed by morning after morning of quiet, assessment, and adjustment, that eventually produces the deep, specific expertise that distinguishes an experienced winter RV lifer from someone attempting this way of living for the very first time. A distinction that becomes especially clear once we look more closely at how different types of campers approach this same underlying challenge. Not every winter camper approaches this challenge from the same starting point, and it is worth pausing here to look at the meaningful differences between the various types of rigs that make up this broader community. Because a travel trailer, a truck camper, and a converted van each present a distinctly different set of advantages and difficulties once subzero temperatures arrive. The travel trailer, towed behind a separate vehicle and disconnected from it once parked, tends to offer the most interior square footage relative to its overall footprint, along with a factory-installed furnace and holding tank system that, while imperfect, at least gives the owner a functional starting point to modify and improve, rather than building an entire heating and water system from scratch. Its principal disadvantage in winter conditions is its underside, since most trailers were designed with minimal attention to what happens beneath the floor, leaving exposed tanks and plumbing that demand the skirting and heat tape solutions we discussed earlier as an absolute necessity rather than an optional upgrade. The truck camper, which sits directly on the bed of a pickup truck rather than being towed separately, offers a meaningfully different profile, smaller overall, but often better insulated relative to its size, and crucially, its water tanks and plumbing typically sit higher off the ground and closer to the heated cab of the truck itself, which can provide a small but genuinely useful thermal advantage compared to a trailer's more exposed underside. What a truck camper sacrifices in exchange for this advantage is interior space, often barely large enough for a bed, a small dinette, and the narrowest possible kitchen counter, meaning the compressed living strategies we discussed in an earlier chapter apply here with even greater urgency. The converted van, meanwhile, represents perhaps the most extreme version of this compression, frequently built out entirely by its owner rather than a manufacturer, with insulation choices, heating systems, and water setups that vary enormously from one build to the next, depending on the specific priorities and skills of whoever constructed it. A well-built winter van conversion can rival a much larger trailer in terms of insulation quality, since the builder has complete control over wall thickness and material choice from the very beginning. But a poorly insulated van, especially one converted quickly on a limited budget without winter use specifically in mind, can prove genuinely dangerous in subzero conditions, losing heat at a rate that even the most disciplined nightly routine struggles to compensate for. Across all three categories, a further distinction matters enormously, namely whether a given camper is connected to shore power and a water hookup at a developed campground, or operating entirely off-grid on batteries, solar panels, and carried water. The camper with hookups faces a meaningfully easier version of this challenge, since electric heaters and heat tape can run continuously without depleting a limited battery reserve, and water can often be run through a heated hose directly from a campground spigot rather than relying entirely on tanks and jugs carried inside. The boondocking camper, parked somewhere without any such infrastructure, faces every challenge we have discussed in its most demanding form, and it is often within this smaller, more self-reliant subset of the winter RV community that the deepest expertise and the most carefully refined systems tend to develop, precisely because there is no fallback option if a mistake is made, no campground host to call, no shore power to simply plug an extra heater into if the battery bank runs low. Manufacturers themselves have, in recent years, begun responding to this specific segment of buyers, and it is worth noting the emergence of what the industry generally calls a four-season package, a set of factory upgrades offered on certain trailer and truck camper models specifically aimed at winter durability. These packages typically add thicker wall and floor insulation, heated and enclosed, underbelly compartments that shield the water tanks and plumbing from direct exposure to outside air, dual pane windows in place of the single pane glass still common on entry-level units, and sometimes a secondary heat source built directly into the underbelly compartment itself to keep tanks from freezing even when the main furnace is running at a lower, more fuel-conservative setting overnight. A camper purchased with one of these packages arrives with a genuine head start compared to an older or more basic unit, though even the best factory four-season package still benefits considerably from the same skirting, window insulation, and careful heat management routines we have already discussed, since no factory insulation package fully eliminates the fundamental thinness of an RV wall compared to a house. Many experienced winter campers, in fact, describe a kind of hybrid strategy that has become increasingly common across the community, starting with a factory four-season model as a stronger foundation, then layering the same hand-built modifications, aftermarket skirting, additional foam board in problem areas identified during a first cold season, heat tape wrapped around any plumbing runs the factory package left exposed, onto that already improved starting point. Whichever category of rig a particular winter camper has chosen, and however much factory support that rig arrived with, the underlying challenge remains the same in its essential shape, even as the specific solutions and margins for error shift considerably from one type of rig to another. One might reasonably assume that a lifestyle built around such extreme isolation would be a lonely one. And yet, the winter RV community, scattered as it is across remote pullouts and quiet off-season campgrounds throughout the coldest regions of North America, has developed a surprisingly dense network of mutual support, most of it conducted not in person, but through a handful of online forums and group chats, where experienced winter campers trade information, with a generosity that might surprise anyone who assumes this kind of self-reliant lifestyle attracts only solitary, closed-off people. A newcomer asking, for the first time, how much propane a small furnace typically consumes at a given temperature will usually receive several detailed, specific answers within hours, drawn from the personal logs of people who have tracked exactly this kind of information across multiple winters. Someone parked in an unfamiliar area during an unexpected cold snap can often find, through these same channels, a fellow winter camper nearby, willing to share advice about local water sources, safe overnight locations, or simply confirmation that the specific weather system moving through the region is expected to pass within a day or two rather than settling in for a week. This informal network extends into physical meetups as well, particularly in certain well-known winter boondocking areas across the desert Southwest and parts of the Mountain West, where small temporary gatherings of winter campers sometimes form for a few days at a time. Trailers and vans parked in a loose cluster, propane heaters running, people stepping between rigs to share a meal or troubleshoot a stubborn water pump problem together. These gatherings tend to be quieter and more practical than one might expect from the phrase community gathering. Less about socializing for its own sake and more about the simple, mutual comfort of being near others who understand precisely what a particular kind of cold night demands, without needing that demand explained or justified. There is also a quieter, less visible form of community that exists simply in the shared knowledge passed down through years of trial and error, techniques for skirting a trailer, methods for insulating a particular brand of window, specific propane heater models known to perform reliably at genuinely low temperatures, all of it accumulated collectively over years by a community with no formal organization or membership, simply a shared interest in solving the same demanding problem well. This informal knowledge base extends into more concrete forms of mutual aid as well, particularly in the handful of regions that have become known within the community as reliable winter gathering areas. Experienced campers in these areas often keep a mental list of which nearby services stay open through the off-season, which propane suppliers offer the best exchange rates, which auto parts store will special order a specific fitting needed to repair a frozen and cracked water line. Information that saves a newcomer hours of frustrated searching during exactly the kind of cold snap when time and warmth both matter most. Physical assistance passes between rigs as readily as information does. A dead battery, difficult to jumpstart in genuinely cold conditions, where even a healthy battery loses a meaningful percentage of its cranking capacity, is rarely a problem. A winter camper faces entirely alone if others are parked nearby, since a set of jumper cables and a few spare minutes cost the helper very little and mean a great deal to whoever needed the assistance. A stuck slide out, a malfunctioning furnace igniter, a water pump that has developed an unfamiliar rattle. All of these mechanical problems tend to draw a small, informal gathering of nearby campers willing to offer an opinion or a spare part from their own supplies, not out of any formal obligation, but simply because the shared difficulty of the conditions everyone is navigating together tends to produce a corresponding willingness to help. For all of the emphasis this way of living places on self-reliance, then, it would be inaccurate to describe it as a solitary pursuit. Rather, it resembles something closer to a distributed, informal apprenticeship, in which newcomers learn from those with more winters behind them and eventually become themselves a source of hard-won knowledge for whoever arrives after them. Cold night by cold night, tank refill by tank refill, until the specific expertise required to survive comfortably in a tiny camper through a subzero winter becomes something like a quiet, shared inheritance passed along an entire scattered community of people who may never meet most of the others they are. In this particular sense, learning alongside. For all of the careful preparation we have described across these chapters, it would be dishonest to suggest that winter RV life proceeds without genuine risk, and the experienced members of this community are typically the first to acknowledge, openly and without much drama, the specific mistakes that have taught them their most important lessons. Carbon monoxide represents perhaps the single most serious hazard, particularly for anyone using a catalytic heater or any combustion appliance not specifically vented to the exterior, since this odorless, colorless gas can accumulate quietly in a small, well-sealed space, with none of the obvious warning signs that might alert an occupant before it becomes dangerous. For this reason, nearly every experienced winter camper treats a functioning carbon monoxide detector as absolutely non-negotiable equipment, checked and tested with the same seriousness that a homeowner might apply to a smoke detector, and many describe a specific early close call, an alarm sounding in the middle of the night during their first or second winter, as the moment they truly internalized how quickly a small mistake in ventilation could turn genuinely dangerous rather than merely uncomfortable. Frozen and burst pipes represent a more common, less immediately dangerous, but still deeply frustrating category of mistake, one that nearly every winter camper eventually experiences at least once, typically during their first cold season before their skirting and heat tape routine has been fully refined, waking to discover a water line has frozen solid overnight, or worse, that a fitting has cracked and will begin leaking the moment temperatures rise enough to thaw it. These early failures, uncomfortable and inconvenient as they are, tend to function as the primary teacher within this community, more effective at building genuine expertise than any amount of advanced reading or forum research, because a person who has personally experienced a frozen line at 2 a.m. develops a specific, lasting attentiveness to that exact vulnerability that no amount of second-hand advice quite replicates. Propane leaks, though rarer thanks to modern regulator and fitting designs, remain a background concern that experienced campers manage through regular visual inspection of connections and hoses, along with a general policy of never running a propane appliance without adequate awareness of the surrounding ventilation situation. And beyond these more dramatic hazards sits a quieter, cumulative risk that many describe as ultimately more relevant to their day-to-day decision-making, namely, the simple physical toll of repeated exposure to genuinely cold conditions during the necessary outdoor tasks, clearing snow, checking skirting, refilling propane, tasks that cannot be avoided regardless of how well the interior of the camper itself has been prepared, and which demand their own specific precautions, proper layering, awareness of frostbite risk on exposed skin, and a general discipline around limiting the duration of any outdoor task to what is genuinely necessary rather than lingering outside longer than the conditions safely allow. Beyond these more acute dangers sits a subtler category of risk that experienced winter campers describe almost as a rite of passage, the accumulation of small procedural mistakes that rarely threaten anyone's safety directly, but teach lasting lessons about the margins involved in this way of living. A person new to winter RV life might forget, on a particularly exhausting evening, to fully reinstall a window insulation panel, only to wake at some unspecified hour to a distinctly colder interior, and the immediate, slightly embarrassed realization of exactly which corner of the camper had been left unsealed. Someone else might misjudge how quickly a battery bank drains when running a space heater overnight without adequate solar recovery the following day, waking not to danger exactly, but to a furnace that will no longer ignite because the battery voltage has dropped below the threshold the ignition system requires. A genuinely uncomfortable lesson learned at exactly the wrong moment and rarely forgotten afterward. These smaller mistakes, uncomfortable rather than dangerous, tend to accumulate during a person's first winter especially, each one teaching a specific, narrow lesson that gradually compounds into the broader intuition experienced campers eventually develop. The sense, difficult to teach directly, but easy to recognize once acquired, for exactly how much margin a given night's preparation actually provides before it becomes insufficient. None of these risks, taken individually or collectively, appear to discourage the community from continuing this particular way of life, but nearly every experienced winter RV lifer we might ask would insist that respect for these specific dangers, rather than fear of them, forms an essential part of what allows this lifestyle to be sustained safely across many consecutive winters, rather than just one. After enough winters spent this way, most people who choose this life eventually arrive at some version of the same underlying question, one worth sitting with for a moment before we move further into our story. Why continue doing something this demanding, something that requires such constant, careful attention to details that a house dweller never has to think about at all, when a simpler, warmer, less labor-intensive alternative sits available to almost anyone willing to sign a lease or a mortgage instead? The answers vary from person to person, but a certain shape recurs often enough across this community to be worth naming directly. Many describe a specific satisfaction in having built, quite literally with their own hands and their own accumulated knowledge, every layer of the comfort they experience on a cold night, rather than simply inheriting that comfort from a structure someone else designed and constructed decades earlier. A furnace that runs in a house was installed by a contractor the homeowner likely never met, according to a code the homeowner never studied. Inside walls the homeowner never personally sealed against drafts. A winter camper's warmth, by contrast, exists specifically because its owner chose each insulation panel, measured and cut each piece of skirting, learned through direct experience exactly how many hours a propane tank lasts at a given temperature. This difference between inherited comfort and constructed comfort matters enormously to the people who continue choosing this life winter after winter, even when an easier alternative remains available to them. There is also, several long-time winter campers have suggested, a specific value in living somewhere the actual weather remains impossible to ignore, a quality increasingly rare in a modern world where climate-controlled homes, offices, and vehicles allow a person to move through an entire winter with barely any direct physical experience of the season, beyond a brief walk between a heated car and a heated building. The winter RV lifer forfeits that comfortable distance entirely, waking each morning to a temperature reading that genuinely matters to their day's plans, watching the sky each afternoon for signs of the next front moving in, developing over time a kind of attentiveness to weather and season that many describe as one of the unexpected rewards of this way of living, rather than one of its burdens. This attentiveness extends beyond mere practical necessity into something closer to genuine appreciation. An ability to notice the specific quality of afternoon light in December, the particular silence that settles over a snow-covered landscape in the hour before dawn, details that remain available to anyone willing to look, but which a life spent mostly indoors, insulated both physically and psychologically from the season outside, makes remarkably easy to overlook entirely. Others point to a simpler, more immediate satisfaction: the sheer sensory pleasure of a small, warm space surrounded on every side by weather, serious enough to be genuinely dangerous. A contrast that a person living in a well-insulated house, disconnected in most practical ways from the actual severity of the winter, outside their double-paned windows, rarely gets to experience quite so directly or quite so vividly. There is a particular kind of gratitude several longtime winter campers have described that comes specifically from having felt the cold closely enough to respect it, and then having built, deliberately and successfully, a small warm refuge against it, rather than simply existing at a comfortable remove from a winter that never actually touches daily life in any meaningful way. As the season eventually turns, as the coldest weeks give way to the first thaw and the skirting comes down, the window insulation panels get packed away for storage, and the heavy curtains get replaced with lighter ones that let more spring light into the small interior. Most winter RV lifers describe this transition with a complicated mixture of relief and something closer to nostalgia, a sense that a genuinely difficult season has been completed successfully, alongside a quieter awareness that the specific rhythm of that season, the nightly sealing ritual, the morning systems check, the particular sound of wind against thin aluminum walls, will be missed in its own way once summer's easier, more forgiving conditions return. And it is this complicated, hard-won relationship with winter itself, respect rather than fear, attentiveness rather than avoidance, that carries us into the next part of our story, as we look more closely at exactly how this entire way of living first took root, and where it continues to be practiced most seriously today. This particular way of living, so deliberate and so demanding in its modern form, did not emerge fully formed, but grew instead out of a much older and more casual tradition, one that most people already recognize, even if they have never thought carefully about its origins. For decades, a certain kind of retiree has spent the cold months traveling south in a motorhome or travel trailer, following warm weather across the continent the way birds do, a practice common enough to have earned its own affectionate nickname among those who do it and those who study them, the snowbird migration, a movement generally understood as an escape from winter rather than an engagement with it. The people we have spent this video discussing represent, in a meaningful sense, the inverse of that older tradition, choosing to remain in or actively seek out the very conditions the snowbird migration was designed to avoid. This inversion did not happen all at once, and tracing its emergence requires looking at several smaller trends that gradually converged. Long before recreational winter camping became a deliberate lifestyle choice documented and discussed across online forums, a smaller and more practical version of it already existed among people whose work simply required them to live somewhere remote and cold for extended stretches. Oilfield workers moving through the northern plains during a drilling boom, wildlife researchers stationed at remote monitoring sites through an entire winter season, seasonal ski resort employees who found permanent housing scarce and expensive in the small mountain towns where they worked and discovered that a used travel trailer, parked in an employee lot or on a friend's rural property, solved that housing problem at a fraction of the cost. These practical, work-driven winter campers developed much of the foundational knowledge that the modern hobbyist and full-time community later inherited and refined. The skirting techniques, the propane management routines, the specific window insulation methods, all originally worked out of necessity by people who had no particular romantic attachment to winter camping, but simply needed a way to stay warm enough to keep working through it. As full-time recreational vehicle living grew more broadly popular over the past 2 decades, driven by a combination of economic pressure, a cultural shift toward valuing experiences and mobility over fixed property ownership, and eventually the rise of remote work that untethered a growing number of people from any single physical office. A subset of this larger movement began deliberately extending their travels into the coldest months rather than following the traditional snowbird pattern south. Online communities that had originally formed around general full-time RV living topics, vehicle maintenance, favorite campgrounds, budget management on the road, gradually developed dedicated subforums and discussion threads specifically focused on cold weather camping. As more members began asking the same basic questions about propane consumption, battery performance in low temperatures, and effective insulation methods, it is within these communities that the specific vocabulary of this way of living crystallized. Terms like boondocking, four-season package, and skirting moving from scattered individual practice into a shared, documented body of knowledge that a genuine newcomer today can access within minutes, a considerable advantage compared to the earlier generation of winter campers who had to work out most of these solutions through direct trial and error, with far less collective wisdom available to draw upon. The role that visual media itself has played in this transformation deserves particular attention, since it mirrors, in an almost circular way, the very kind of video we are producing together tonight. Early winter camping enthusiasts documenting their own preparations, often on modest home video cameras long before the current era of polished production, uploaded footage showing exactly how a particular skirting method was installed or how a specific window insulation panel was cut and fitted, and these early, unpolished videos became genuinely foundational reference material for the community that followed, watched and rewatched by newcomers trying to understand a technique described only in text on a forum thread. As the broader online audience for this kind of content grew, driven partly by a rising general interest in tiny living and off-grid self-sufficiency across unrelated corners of the internet, winter RV preparation itself became a recognizable subgenre, with certain specific techniques, certain particular products, and certain approaches to propane and battery management achieving something close to consensus status, simply because they had been demonstrated successfully, on camera, by enough different people, in enough different conditions to establish genuine confidence in their effectiveness. This gradual codification, moving from scattered individual practice toward a documented, testable, and widely shared body of technique, represents perhaps the single most significant shift separating the modern winter RV community from the more isolated practitioners who preceded it by only a decade or two. A shift that continues even now, as new products, new insulation materials, and new approaches to battery and solar technology work their way through the same informal testing and documentation process that has shaped this community's accumulated knowledge from its earliest days. Today, this way of living plays out across a surprisingly wide range of geography, though certain regions have become particularly well known within the community for the specific combination of cold, accessibility, and available services that makes serious winter camping there both demanding and genuinely practical. The interior regions of Alaska and the Yukon represent perhaps the most extreme end of this spectrum, where winter temperatures routinely drop far below anything experienced across most of the contiguous United States, and where the small, scattered population of year-round RV dwellers in this region tend to be almost exclusively local residents rather than traveling hobbyists, people for whom a trailer or a converted bus represents genuinely affordable housing in a region where conventional construction costs run extraordinarily high due to the remoteness and the challenging building conditions. Further south, the northern plains states and the prairie provinces of Canada host a different category of winter RV dweller, often connected to the region's oil and agricultural industries, work camps of trailers and campers clustered near drilling sites or large farming operations. Less a lifestyle choice in the recreational sense, and more a practical housing solution for a transient workforce that needs to be near a specific job site for a defined stretch of time. The Mountain West, encompassing the ski towns and high-elevation communities of Colorado, Wyoming, and parts of Montana and Idaho, has become home to a particularly visible and well-documented segment of the recreational winter camping community, drawn there by seasonal work at ski resorts, by the sheer scenic appeal of mountain winters, and in no small part by a regional housing crisis that has made conventional rental options scarce and expensive in many of these small mountain towns, pushing a growing number of seasonal workers toward vehicle dwelling as a practical necessity, rather than a purely voluntary lifestyle experiment. Further south still, the desert regions of Arizona and New Mexico host a somewhat different winter camping culture, one where subzero nights are less common, but still occur often enough during cold snaps to require many of the same preparations we have discussed throughout this video, and where the sheer number of winter RV dwellers gathering in certain well-known desert locations has produced some of the largest informal winter camping communities anywhere in North America, complete with organized gatherings, shared resources, and a level of social density that stands in sharp contrast to the more isolated, scattered winter camping typical of the northern regions we discussed earlier. What unites these otherwise quite different regions is not the specific temperature range each one produces, since a sub-zero night in interior Alaska bears little numerical resemblance to an occasional hard freeze in the high desert of New Mexico, but rather the particular relationship each region's camping community has developed with its own local climate patterns over years of accumulated experience. A winter camper spending their first season in the Mountain West quickly learns that cold in this particular region often arrives suddenly, driven by fast-moving fronts that can drop the temperature by 20 or 30 degrees within a matter of hours, demanding a kind of vigilant, short-notice preparation, different in character from the more sustained, predictable cold. Typical of the far north, where a given cold snap might last a full week or more, but arrives with considerably more advance warning from the extended forecast. Desert winter campers, by contrast, often describe a particular challenge specific to their region, namely the dramatic daily temperature swing common to arid climates, where a genuinely mild, even warm afternoon can give way to a hard freeze after sunset, as the desert's dry air releases the day's accumulated heat rapidly into a clear night sky, a swing that demands flexible, easily adjustable heating and insulation strategies rather than the more static, sustained cold weather setup favored by campers in consistently frigid northern regions. This regional variation extends into the specific vocabulary and shared knowledge each local community develops, with desert boondockers trading tips about managing rapid nightfall temperature drops, mountain campers focused heavily on wind protection and rapid onset storm preparation, and northern campers emphasizing sustained fuel reserves and redundant heating systems capable of running reliably through many consecutive days of unbroken cold. Regardless of which specific region a winter camper calls home for a given season, this same underlying pattern repeats itself across the entire community, a body of highly specific, locally adapted knowledge built gradually through repeated seasonal experience and shared generously among neighbors and online community members, facing the same particular version of winter that their own chosen landscape has decided to provide. Across all of these varied geographies, the underlying challenge we have spent this entire video exploring remains fundamentally consistent, even as the specific severity of the cold, the density of the surrounding community, and the practical reasons driving people toward this way of living shift considerably from one region to the next. To understand what this way of living actually feels like day to day, rather than simply cataloging its techniques and its geography, it helps to follow a single composite version of this life across the arc of an ordinary winter week, drawing on the patterns and details described consistently enough across this community to represent a genuinely typical experience rather than any one specific individual's story. Picture, then, a person in their early 30s, working a remote job that requires nothing more than a laptop and a reliable internet connection, parked in a small camper van somewhere in the foothills outside a mountain town in Colorado, chosen specifically for its combination of cell signal strength and relative shelter from the harshest wind that sweeps across more exposed terrain nearby. Monday morning begins, as most mornings do, with the systems check we described earlier: propane, battery percentage, overnight low temperature, followed by a short walk to clear snow from the solar panels mounted on the van's roof before settling in at the small fold-down desk for a full day of remote work, interrupted only by the occasional need to step outside and check on a generator running to supplement solar input during a stretch of overcast weather. Evenings follow the ceiling ritual we have described in detail: window panels installed, curtains drawn, heater checked and adjusted, and by midweek a familiar rhythm has fully established itself: work during daylight hours, careful maintenance at dusk, and a quiet evening spent reading or talking with a partner in the small, warm space that constitutes, for this particular person, the entirety of home. A cold snap arrives partway through the week, as it often does, dropping the overnight low considerably lower than the previous several nights, and this single change ripples through every part of the daily routine. An extra check of the propane gauge before bed, a decision to run the generator slightly longer than usual to ensure the battery bank has adequate reserve, a slightly earlier bedtime specifically to avoid running errands after dark, when the coldest temperatures typically arrive. By the weekend, with the cold snap having passed and milder temperatures returning, our composite winter camper makes the necessary supply run into town, refilling a propane tank, restocking groceries, and taking advantage of a public shower facility at a nearby gym membership maintained specifically for this purpose, since a small camper van rarely includes a full shower setup adequate for daily winter use. This particular week, unremarkable by the standards of this community, illustrates something important about winter RV life that raw statistics about insulation thickness and propane consumption rates cannot quite capture on their own, namely, that this way of living, however demanding its individual tasks might sound in isolation, settles over time into something closer to an ordinary rhythm than a constant emergency, a life built around specific, repeated attentions rather than perpetual crisis, precisely because those attentions have become, through sufficient repetition, simply the shape of an average week rather than an extraordinary effort each time. There are moments within even this settled, ordinary rhythm, however, when the underlying demands of the lifestyle become briefly, sharply visible again, usually triggered by some small equipment failure that a house dweller would consider a minor inconvenience, but that carries genuinely different weight inside a 200-square-foot van parked well outside any easy reach of a repair shop. A water pump that begins cycling erratically partway through a workday, for instance, forces an immediate decision about whether the problem can wait until evening or requires an interruption to the workday itself, since a failing pump left unaddressed through a cold afternoon risks a frozen line by nightfall that a functioning pump would have prevented simply by keeping water moving rather than sitting stagnant in an exposed section of tubing. Our composite remote worker, encountering exactly this kind of problem on a Thursday afternoon, partway through an important video call, describes the specific, practiced calm that experienced winter campers develop around these interruptions, muting the call for a moment, stepping outside to check the pump's wiring connection with a headlamp clipped to a jacket, resolving the issue within a few practical minutes, and returning to the call with barely any disruption to the workday itself. This particular competence, the ability to diagnose and resolve a small mechanical problem quickly and without significant disruption to whatever else the day requires, represents one of the quieter but genuinely essential skills this lifestyle demands, distinct from but closely related to the nightly ceiling ritual and the morning systems check we have already described in considerable detail throughout this video. Not every version of this life follows the same shape, however, and it is worth pausing to consider a meaningfully different archetype within this same broader community: the full-time retired couple who have chosen winter camping not out of financial or professional necessity, but as a deliberate lifestyle decision made after decades in a conventional house. Picture a couple in their late 60s, having sold a family home several years earlier, now traveling in a larger travel trailer equipped with a factory 4-season package, connected to shore power, and a water hookup at a developed campground specifically chosen for its winter services, a meaningfully different set of circumstances compared to the boondocking van dweller we just described, though facing many of the same underlying challenges in a somewhat gentler form. Their days follow a different rhythm entirely, unstructured by the demands of remote work, filled instead with the specific small pleasures available to people who have chosen this life deliberately rather than out of necessity. Morning walks through the campground when weather permits, an afternoon spent reading in a well-insulated trailer connected to reliable electric heat, evening phone calls with adult children and grandchildren living in conventional houses many states away who often express a mixture of admiration and mild concern about a lifestyle that strikes them as impressively adventurous and somewhat impractical in equal measure. This couple's version of winter camping benefits considerably from the campground hookups unavailable to the more remote boondocker, running an electric space heater continuously without concern for battery depletion, connecting a heated water hose directly to a campground spigot rather than relying entirely on carried water, luxuries that meaningfully ease the daily burden of winter camping, even as the fundamental thinness of their trailer's walls remains exactly the same challenge facing every other camper in this community, regardless of income or equipment. What strikes most observers who spend time with couples living this particular version of winter RV life is the sheer contentment many of them express, a sense of having found, after decades in a much larger and more expensive home, a version of comfort that feels, in their own words, somehow more genuine specifically because it requires more deliberate attention to maintain, a sentiment that echoes, in a gentler and more leisurely key, the same underlying philosophy the remote working van dweller expressed through the more demanding rhythm of a boondocking week. The decision that led this particular couple to winter camping in the first place, when they describe it themselves, rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment, but rather as a gradual accumulation of smaller realizations spread across several years of conventional retirement. A house that once felt appropriately sized for raising children began, once those children moved out and built lives of their own, to feel unnecessarily large, filled with rooms rarely used, and furniture maintained more out of habit than genuine need. The physical and financial burden of maintaining that house, a roof requiring periodic replacement, a furnace requiring servicing, property taxes rising steadily year over year, began to weigh more heavily against its benefits, particularly once both partners had reached an age where the physical demands of home maintenance felt increasingly burdensome rather than simply routine. The eventual decision to sell, downsize dramatically, and adopt a full-time traveling lifestyle followed a fairly common pattern within this particular archetype of the winter camping community: an initial summer spent traveling in warmer weather to test whether the lifestyle suited them at all, followed by a gradually increasing comfort and confidence that eventually extended their travels into the colder months as well, first cautiously in regions with only mild winter conditions, and only after several successful seasons venturing into the genuinely subzero conditions that define the specific winter camping we have spent this entire video exploring. Their adult children, as mentioned earlier, tend to view this decision with a particular mixture of pride and concern common across this entire archetype within the community, proud of their parents' evident adaptability and continued sense of adventure well into their later years, while occasionally worrying, especially during a particularly harsh cold snap reported on the news, whether their parents are managing safely enough in conditions that strike most conventional house dwellers as genuinely alarming to imagine living through. These calls home, several couples in this archetype describe, have become their own small ritual within the larger nightly and weekly rhythm of winter camping life. A brief video call reassuring worried adult children that the propane tank is full, the battery bank is charged, and the small warm trailer parked somewhere in the snow remains, as it has through every previous winter, entirely capable of holding back whatever the night outside has planned. Between these two archetypes, the necessity-driven remote worker and the leisure-driven retired couple, sits a third and perhaps less visible category worth acknowledging. Before we move further into our story, the seasonal worker whose winter camping arises not from personal preference in either direction, but from straightforward economic pressure in a housing market that has simply outpaced what a part-time or entry-level wage can reasonably support. Ski resort towns across the Mountain West, mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter, have become particularly well-documented examples of this pressure, where the same scenic mountain setting that draws wealthy second home buyers and short-term vacation renters has driven housing costs to levels far beyond what the resort's own lift operators, ski instructors, and restaurant staff can afford, leaving many of these workers with genuinely few housing options beyond a vehicle parked in an employer-provided lot or on inexpensive land outside town. For this category of winter camper, the careful insulation and heat management techniques we have spent this video describing are not optional refinements pursued for comfort or philosophy, but genuine necessities for holding down a job that, in turn, makes the entire arrangement financially viable in the first place. Many describe learning these winter camping skills under considerable time pressure during their very first season, absorbing techniques quickly from coworkers already living this way, rather than through the more leisurely research and forum reading available to someone approaching this lifestyle by choice rather than necessity. There is a particular resilience visible in this specific segment of the winter RV community, people managing physically demanding jobs, often on their feet outdoors in genuinely cold conditions for entire shifts, returning each evening to a small camper that must then be transformed through the same nightly ritual we have described throughout this video into a warm enough space to actually rest and recover before the next shift begins. Their weekends, when they exist at all during a busy ski season, often involve the same supply runs and maintenance tasks described in our earlier composite portraits: propane refills, water restocking, occasional repairs, compressed into whatever limited free time a demanding work schedule allows, leaving considerably less margin for error or recovery compared to either the flexible remote worker or the fully retired couple we discussed previously. It would be a mistake to romanticize this particular version of winter RV life as simply another equally valid lifestyle choice among several, since the economic pressure driving it represents a genuine and, according to many housing researchers who study these mountain communities, worsening problem rather than a neutral preference. And yet, even within this more difficult, less voluntary version of winter camping, many workers describe developing the same specific competence and quiet pride in their accumulated skill that we have heard echoed across every other archetype in this video, a testament to how thoroughly this particular set of challenges, regardless of why a person ends up facing them, tends to produce a similar depth of expertise and a similar community of shared knowledge among those who face it together. Employers within the resort and hospitality industries have, in some cases, begun responding to this situation directly. A small but growing number of ski resorts now offering designated, plowed, and sometimes even electrified parking areas, specifically for employees living in vehicles through the winter season. An acknowledgement, however partial, of a housing reality that has become too widespread to ignore entirely. These designated areas, when they exist, provide a meaningful improvement over the more precarious arrangements many seasonal workers relied on previously: informal permission to park on a friend's rural property, or a rotating series of legally ambiguous overnight spots around town. Arrangements that carried their own quiet stress, layered on top of the already demanding physical requirements of winter camping itself. Even with this modest institutional support beginning to emerge in certain locations, the underlying economic pressure driving this particular archetype of winter RV living shows little sign of easing broadly across the mountain resort industry, and many workers within this community describe treating their winter camping skill not as a temporary inconvenience to be endured until circumstances improve, but as a genuinely valuable, transferable competence, one that several have gone on to apply toward eventually building the kind of voluntary, more comfortable full-time RV lifestyle we described in our earlier chapters. Once their financial circumstances allowed them to make that transition from necessity toward genuine choice. Having now walked through the history of this way of living, the varied geography where it plays out most seriously, and several distinct versions of the daily life it produces, we find ourselves returning, as we often do on this channel, to a question raised earlier and worth revisiting with everything we now understand added to it. What, exactly, does a person gain from mastering a set of skills this specific, this demanding, and this thoroughly focused on simply staying warm through conditions most of the modern world has engineered itself to never directly experience at all? Across every archetype we have described, the remote worker, the retired couple, the seasonal resort employee, a similar thread has emerged despite their considerably different circumstances and motivations: a sense that genuine competence, earned specifically through repeated exposure to a real and unforgiving challenge, produces a particular kind of confidence that comfort alone, inherited rather than built, simply cannot replicate. This is not a claim that winter RV living represents some universally superior way to spend a cold season, nor a suggestion that the genuine hardships faced by the economically pressured seasonal worker deserve to be framed identically to the voluntary adventure of the remote worker or the leisurely choice of the retired couple. It is, instead, an observation about what happens to a person's relationship with difficulty itself, once that difficulty becomes familiar enough to be managed skillfully rather than merely endured. A transformation visible across every version of this life we have examined tonight, and one that will carry us forward, in the chapters ahead, into an even closer examination of the specific, coldest nights this community faces each winter, and exactly how thin walls, careful preparation, and hard-won experience combine to turn conditions that would otherwise be genuinely life-threatening into something this community has learned, through considerable effort, to call simply another ordinary night. Every experienced member of this community carries at least one story of a night that pushed their preparation closer to its actual limit than any of their more routine winter evenings ever had. And these stories, shared quietly among people who understand exactly what they represent, tend to teach lessons no amount of ordinary practice quite manages to convey on its own. One such story, recounted often enough across different winter camping forums to represent a genuinely common experience rather than a rare exception, involves a sudden, unforecast temperature drop, arriving well below what the evening's preparation had anticipated. A front moving through faster and colder than predicted, catching even an experienced camper with a propane tank calculated for a milder night and a battery bank not quite topped off from a day of limited sun. In stories like this, the specific sequence of small decisions made once the mismatch between preparation and reality becomes clear, often matters more than any single piece of equipment. A decision to layer an extra blanket immediately, rather than waiting to see if the furnace could keep pace on its own. A decision to close off the sleeping area entirely, with a hung blanket to concentrate whatever heat remained into the smallest possible volume. A decision to accept a slightly less comfortable night in exchange for genuine safety margin, rather than pushing equipment toward its absolute limit simply to maintain an accustomed level of comfort. These accounts almost never end in genuine emergency, precisely because the community's accumulated caution, the redundant systems, the conservative margins built into most experienced campers' routines, tend to absorb even a meaningfully worse than expected night without crossing into actual danger. But they do end, almost universally, with a specific and permanent adjustment to that person's future preparation. A slightly larger propane reserve carried from that point forward. A slightly earlier threshold for topping off batteries before a stretch of uncertain weather. A habit of checking the extended forecast one additional time before finalizing the evening's preparations, rather than trusting an earlier check made several hours before. It is through the accumulation of exactly these kinds of stories, told and retold across a community that has no formal training program or certification process, that the collective margin of safety this entire way of living depends upon continues to widen gradually with each passing winter, not through any single dramatic improvement, but through thousands of small, specific adjustments made by individuals who each encountered their own particular version of a night that asked slightly more of them than they had originally planned for, and who each, in turn, made sure to prepare a little more generously the following time. A related category of close call, somewhat less common, but described often enough within the community to warrant mention, involves a mechanical failure rather than a weather surprise, a furnace igniter failing partway through a genuinely cold night, or a propane regulator freezing shut due to moisture accumulated inside the line during a particularly humid stretch of weather beforehand. Campers who have experienced this specific failure describe a particular kind of calm problem-solving that develops only through direct experience, recognizing within minutes that the primary heat source has stopped functioning, immediately switching to whatever backup system they had prepared in advance. A smaller catalytic heater kept specifically for exactly this situation, or in some cases simply piling on every available blanket and layer while troubleshooting the primary system by headlamp, all while monitoring their own body temperature and that of anyone else sharing the camper closely enough to recognize the earlier warning signs of genuine cold exposure well before those signs became dangerous. What distinguishes these accounts from genuine emergencies, almost without exception, is the presence of a backup plan established well in advance of the actual failure, a redundancy built into the system specifically because experienced campers understand that any single piece of equipment, however well maintained, can fail unexpectedly on precisely the night its performance matters most. Winters themselves, several longtime members of this community have observed with a consistency worth noting, seem to have grown somewhat less predictable over the years they have spent living this way, a pattern that mirrors broader observations made across a range of scientific and meteorological research regarding shifting weather patterns in many regions. This shifting unpredictability shows up within the winter RV community, less as a debate about broader causes and more as a very practical, day-to-day challenge, since the entire system of careful preparation we have described throughout this video depends heavily on a reasonably accurate extended forecast and a winter climate that produces more frequent, unexpected swings. Unusually mild stretches followed abruptly by unusually severe cold snaps, or the reverse, complicates that forecasting in ways that demand a corresponding increase in flexibility and redundancy from anyone relying on it. Experienced campers describe adapting to this shifting reliability, less through any single dramatic change and more through a general increase in the safety margins built into their existing routines, carrying a slightly larger propane reserve than strict calculation alone would suggest is necessary, maintaining battery and solar systems capable of running comfortably even during an unusually long stretch of overcast weather, rather than sizing those systems for an average winter's typical sun exposure, and treating even a seemingly reliable 7-day forecast with a degree of healthy skepticism that an earlier generation of winter campers, working with a somewhat more stable and predictable climate pattern, may not have found quite as necessary. This adaptive flexibility, built gradually into the community's shared practices over recent years, represents perhaps the clearest illustration of something we have touched on throughout this entire video, namely that winter RV living has never been a static skill set learned once and applied unchanged forever, but rather a continuously evolving body of practical knowledge, adjusting itself season after season to whatever specific version of winter the current climate happens to be producing. This adjustment extends beyond individual preparation into the shared knowledge base of the community itself, with online discussions increasingly focused not simply on how to handle a typical cold night for a given region, but on how to prepare for genuine volatility, maintaining enough flexibility in a given winter's travel plans to relocate on relatively short notice if an unusually severe system develops, keeping enough spare capacity in propane and battery reserves to absorb an unexpectedly long stretch of extreme cold without requiring an emergency supply run in conditions that might make such a trip genuinely hazardous, and treating even well-established regional patterns, the reliably mild desert evening, the predictably sustained northern cold snap, as useful general guidance rather than absolute certainty. Longtime members of this community often describe a specific mental shift accompanying this adaptation, moving away from planning around an expected average winter toward planning around a wider range of plausible outcomes, a shift that mirrors, in its own small and practical way, adjustments being made across many other outdoor and agricultural communities navigating a similarly less predictable climate in their own specific domains. Alongside this growing emphasis on flexibility and margin, the underlying technology available to winter RV lifers has itself continued to evolve steadily, and it is worth pausing to consider how much of the equipment we described earlier in this video, foundational as it now seems to the community's shared practice, represents a relatively recent development compared to the decades-long history of RV camping more broadly. Battery technology in particular has shifted considerably over a fairly short span of years, with lithium-based battery banks gradually replacing the older lead-acid batteries that dominated RV power systems for most of the previous century, offering considerably better performance in cold conditions specifically, since lead-acid batteries lose a meaningful percentage of their usable capacity as temperatures drop, precisely the conditions under which a winter camper depends on that capacity most heavily. This shift toward lithium power has, in turn, enabled a broader shift toward electric heating solutions that would have proven impractical only a decade earlier, since a lithium battery bank can sustain a meaningful electric heating load for considerably longer than an equivalent lead-acid setup, reducing, though not entirely eliminating, the community's traditional heavy reliance on propane as the primary overnight heat source. Solar technology has advanced alongside these battery improvements, with more efficient panels capable of generating a meaningful charge even under the shorter, weaker daylight conditions typical of winter months, when the sun sits lower in the sky and daylight hours themselves run considerably shorter than during the summer camping season most RVs were originally designed around. Monitoring technology has perhaps changed the daily experience of winter camping most visibly of all, with small digital displays and connected phone applications now providing real-time information about battery percentage, propane level, and interior and exterior temperature that earlier generations of winter campers had to estimate through far less precise methods. A rough sense of remaining propane based on tank weight, an educated guess about battery charge based on how dim the interior lights had grown. This move toward precise, real-time monitoring has allowed the community's traditional caution and conservative safety margins to become considerably more efficient, since a camper who can see their exact battery percentage and propane level at any given moment no longer needs to build quite as much uncertainty buffer into their planning as an earlier generation working from rougher estimates alone. None of this technological progress has eliminated the fundamental challenge we have spent this entire video exploring. The thin walls, the demanding nightly ritual, the constant attention required to translate a structure never designed for subzero survival into one genuinely capable of it. But it has made that challenge somewhat more manageable, somewhat more precisely understood, and somewhat more forgiving of the ordinary small mistakes that every winter camper, however experienced, continues to make from time to time. Insulation materials themselves have also continued to improve steadily, with newer reflective foam products and vacuum-insulated panels offering meaningfully better performance per inch of thickness than the materials available to winter campers even a decade earlier, allowing modern do-it-yourself modifications to achieve results that once required considerably bulkier and more cumbersome solutions. Communication technology has changed the community's shared knowledge base as well, with satellite communication devices, once prohibitively expensive and limited mostly to serious wilderness expeditions, becoming increasingly affordable, and now carried by a growing number of boondocking winter campers, specifically as a safety measure for the more remote locations this lifestyle sometimes involves, allowing a camper well outside typical cell coverage to check an updated forecast or, in a genuine emergency, request assistance without needing to rely entirely on whatever information they had gathered before losing signal the previous day. Taken together, these various technological improvements in batteries, in solar generation, in monitoring, in insulation, and in communication have not fundamentally altered the core challenge this entire video has explored, but they have meaningfully expanded the margin for error available to anyone taking on that challenge today, compared to even a single generation of winter campers before them. Stepping back now from the specific techniques, the regional variations, and the gradually evolving technology we have spent this video examining in such detail, it is worth returning, one final time, to the image we began with. A small camper sitting quietly in the snow, lamplit, curtains drawn, holding warmth inside walls thin enough to knock on and hear clearly how little separates the people inside from a genuinely dangerous winter night. That image, we suggested at the very beginning of this video, represents something quietly remarkable, and having now walked through everything that goes into making it possible, the sealing and insulating, the careful propane and battery calculations, the compressed daily rhythms, the accumulated regional knowledge, the gradual technological improvements, the hard lessons learned from close calls and small mistakes alike, it is perhaps easier now to see exactly why that remarkableness holds up under closer examination, rather than dissolving into something more mundane, once fully explained. A house is warm because thick walls and a buried furnace make it so, largely without requiring its occupants to think carefully about that warmth at all. A tiny camper surviving a sub-zero winter night is warm because a specific person, drawing on knowledge built through their own experience and inherited generously from an entire scattered community of people who came before them, made a long sequence of careful, deliberate decisions, and continues making those decisions night after night throughout an entire demanding season. There is something worth sitting with in that difference, a reminder that comfort, however we happen to experience it, is rarely simply given to us by our surroundings, but is instead something built through attention and effort and accumulated skill against whatever conditions we find ourselves facing. This distinction matters. Several longtime members of this community have suggested, well beyond the narrow context of winter camping itself, offering a small but genuine lesson applicable to comfort and security of almost any kind. The recognition that resilience built through direct, attentive effort tends to carry a different quality than security simply provided by circumstance. A steadier, more durable confidence, precisely because it has already been tested directly against real difficulty and found, through that testing, to hold. The winter RV lifer, closing their curtains against another sub-zero night, checking their propane gauge one final time before settling into a bed warmed through hours of careful, deliberate preparation, embodies this particular kind of earned confidence about as clearly and as literally as any example we might find. Their comfort built quite visibly, panel by panel and decision by decision, against conditions that would otherwise make comfort of any kind impossible to imagine. So what does a sub-zero winter night inside a tiny camper actually leave behind once we have walked all the way through it as we have tonight? It leaves a thin aluminum wall, no thicker than a few layers of foam and metal, standing successfully between a warm interior and a genuinely lethal exterior temperature. It leaves a nightly ritual, window panels fitted into place, curtains drawn, propane and battery levels checked one final time, repeated with such consistency that it eventually stops feeling like effort at all and simply becomes the shape of an ordinary evening. It leaves a scattered community of people, remote workers and retired couples and seasonal resort employees, each arriving at this particular way of living through very different circumstances, yet each developing a remarkably similar depth of hard-won expertise once enough winters have passed beneath their thin, carefully sealed walls. It leaves a history stretching back through practical necessity, long before it became a documented, deliberate lifestyle. Workers and researchers solving this exact problem out of plain necessity decades before any online community existed to document their methods, and a geography spanning some of the coldest, most demanding regions on the entire continent, from the interior stretches of Alaska and the Yukon down through the northern plains, the mountain resort towns, and the arid winter deserts of the Southwest, each region teaching its own particular version of the same underlying lesson. It leaves a technology still quietly evolving, lithium batteries and efficient solar panels and precise digital monitoring gradually easing a challenge that remains, at its core, exactly as demanding as it has always been, alongside a growing awareness within the community that the winters themselves are shifting, less predictable now than they once were. A change met not with alarm, but with the same steady, practical adaptation this community has always applied to whatever specific difficulty it faces. It leaves stories of close calls survived through calm, well-rehearsed problem-solving rather than panic, each one adding a small, permanent adjustment to the collective caution this entire way of living depends upon. It leaves a history stretching back through practical necessity long before it became a documented, deliberate lifestyle. and a geography spanning some of the coldest, most demanding regions on the entire continent. It leaves a technology still quietly evolving: lithium batteries and efficient solar panels, and precise digital monitoring, gradually easing a challenge that remains at its core exactly as demanding as it has always been. And it leaves, perhaps most importantly, a quiet, well-earned confidence in the people who have chosen to live this way. A confidence built specifically through repeated exposure to real difficulty, rather than through any comfort simply inherited from thick walls and a buried furnace they never had to think about at all. If you found tonight's journey through the world of Winter R5 living, calming, or interesting, or simply a pleasant way to spend some time thinking about warmth built carefully against genuine cold, I would be grateful if you liked this video and subscribed to Coldman Survival. It helps this small channel find other people who might enjoy slowing down at the end of a long day with stories like this one. Stories about the quiet, patient work of staying warm in places the rest of the world assumes to be unsurvivable. Perhaps you are listening tonight from somewhere cold yourself, wind pressing gently against your own window as these words settle you toward sleep. Or perhaps you are simply drawn, as so many of us are, to picture a small lamp glowing steadily inside a snow-covered camper, warmth held carefully behind walls thin enough to hear the wind against, night after night, all winter long. Either way, I hope this has been the kind of story that helped you drift off slowly, one detail at a time, the way a careful hand seals a window against the cold, one small panel at a time, until the whole night is held safely at bay. Sleep well, fellow traveler, wherever you are listening from tonight. Out there in the snow, a small lamp is still glowing, a kettle is still warm, and the wind, however hard it pushes against those thin walls tonight, is not getting in